Hi, I'm seeking guidance regarding a 24-year-old Aboriginal male client who has given his informed consent. He was referred by his GP for assessment due to concerns of persistent low mood, along with a request for an ADHD screener following work disengagement and increased distractibility. Upon initial consultations, the clients reported similar depressive symptoms, such as feelings of heaviness and limited interest in socializing. I acknowledge that I have limited experience working with Aboriginal clients and I'm feeling quite out of my depth. He also shared negative experiences in the past with clinicians and declined standardized assessments, which are typically my area of confidence. I've had a go solving the dilemma using the KKS model and I'd appreciate some advice. After lots of contemplation, I identify a clear dilemma between ensuring my professional competence whilst also maintaining respect for the client. As stated in Standard B.1 of our Code of Conduct, psychologists must monitor their competence and only provide services within their scope of expertise. I recognise the limits in both my professional and lived experiences and would need to engage in professional development to increase my skills. I have also reviewed the APS guidelines for working with Aboriginal clients, which recommend psychologists to seek guidance from Indigenous clinicians when concerns arise relating to the cultural appropriateness of their practice. This conflicts, however, with Standard A.2, as psychologists must also respect the moral rights and dignity of clients when behaving in manners which are not demeaning. I am concerned that if I use this case as an opportunity to increase my professional competence, I may accidentally disrespect the client, exposing them to greater risks of marginalisation. When considering contextual factors, I recognise that the client has already encountered culturally insensitive practitioners, and he seems quite hesitant to access support. At this point, I began to wonder if continuing the service would be for the benefit of the client or for my own professional interests. This prompted me to engage in deep reflection to consider how my emotions and self interest could be influenced in this decision. Since a young age, I have been a high achiever with perfectionistic tendencies, functioning as a mechanism for feeling in control. When making this decision, my perfectionism risks narrowing my ethical focus towards avoiding errors rather than centering the client's autonomy and well-being as the highest priority. This is supported by Kakachi and Desai's 2015 study, finding unethical behavior to be more likely amongst anxious psychologists who perceive higher threats. I have also considered the cultural dimensions here. The client lives in a regional town in the Northern Territory with a strong spiritual connection to land. On the other hand, however, I am a highly educated Caucasian female who has grown up in metropolitan Sydney, which may unintentionally create power imbalances. Historical mistrust towards Westernized interventions is explained by the UN to be a result of the vast history of Aboriginal people being deeply disadvantaged and traumatized by European settlement. Whilst my intentions of working with this client is focused in reconciliation, my perfectionistic tendencies are reinforcing this fear of getting it wrong. In the AAPI's employment guidelines, employers are encouraged to foster environments where professional psychologists feel safe to seek support and make mistakes. The AAPI also recognise that I am at a greater risk of psychological harm when I am working in remote areas, exposed to vicarious trauma, and are performing outside my scope of confidence. Therefore, my inexperience within the profession and the location of this workplace creates added risk factors in making ethical decisions. I must also consider the subclauses within the Standard B.1, which place emphasis on my psychological fitness and my right to terminate services if this is questioned. Considering the decision from the client's perspective, however, involved reviewing their legislative rights. The Racial Discrimination Act 1975 clearly stipulates that it is unlawful to refuse mental health services to any person based on their race. In a 2016 systematic review by Brown and colleagues, it was found that rural youth experienced compounding barriers when seeking mental health support, such as negative experiences with past clinicians, shame around help seeking, costs, and service inaccessibility. Considering this, it appears both unethical and impractical to refer the client to alternate or Indigenous colleague. Upon first instinct, service referral to Indigenous psychologists would seem to be the most ethical solution. This would hopefully ensure culturally sensitive intervention and assessments whilst maintaining unique interpersonal communication between the client and practitioner. In addition, the client would be likely to trust an Aboriginal psychologist who can empathise through shared understandings. However, the practicality and potential consequences of this option must not be overlooked. In 2019, the ABS reported 31% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to be experiencing a high level of mental distress. Moreover, in 2022, over 50% of residents in the Northern Territory had been diagnosed with lifelong mental health disorders. This percentage is actually much larger, likely, as the data was collected from records of individuals who had already accessed system support. The Northern Territory is clearly experiencing a mental health crisis, with limited services to support the population. Whilst my intentions of service referral would be to protect the client's well-being, it would actually likely contribute to greater pressure on the rural mental health system and could increase wait times. Therefore, I strongly believe the most ethical solution for this dilemma would be to continue the provision of services while simultaneously undergoing rigorous clinical supervision and professional development. As I've previously identified, the risk of continuing the service would be to accidentally expose the client to further discrimination. In 2014, G and colleagues explained that disrupting Indigenous people's unique connections to mind, body, and spirit places them at a significantly higher risk of experiencing further socio-emotional distress. However, both the APS guidelines and reconciliation plan support me in working towards closing the gap for Indigenous people's mental health outcomes. This can be achieved by prioritising my client's autonomy in the decision-making progress, in turn fostering a trusting relationship which is grounded in mutual respect. Whilst it may be impractical to refer the client to an Indigenous clinician, I plan to seek guidance and mentorship relating to culturally appropriate interventions and assessments through Indigenous colleagues. In collaboration with both my client and Indigenous colleagues, I will create a professional development plan to extend my competence moving forward. Therefore, through positioning myself with the client, I will continue to improve in my practice and the client will receive the support they require. These are my thoughts. Let me know what you think.